Okay, hi. So in this video, we're going to be talking about everything Sarah Waters. It's rare that I do this, but I have read and completed all the works written by Sarah Waters. I'm usually not dedicated to reading someone's entire backlist, but Sarah Waters' backlist is rather small because it is only 6 books. So I want to talk about a few things. I want to talk about the plot. I want to talk about why people like Sarah Waters, why you might want to read Sarah Waters. I want to talk, maybe guide people based off of the type of book it is to the best book for you. And then I kind of want to order the books a few different ways so that you can see chronology and how the general public feels about them and that ranking. And then at the end, I want to give my ranking list. So yeah, let's get started. Why read Sarah Waters? So I'm going to convince you, or attempt to, that Sarah Waters is a good author for you. So Sarah Waters, at her core, writes lesbian historic fiction that takes place in London or nearby London. Her books are very character-driven. They are very, I think that you could come to Sarah Waters for multiple things. One thing off the bat is the characters. Her characters feel very alive. I always feel that the emotions that the characters have, I can feel very viscerally in a way that I don't always get and I think is special about Sarah Waters. Their tension, their anxieties, their passions, I really feel and empathize with as a reader, even if those are not the way I would react to a situation. And I think that that's very special in an author. Another one is vibes. The setting, the feelings, the tension, it always feels like a very lived-in environment. You can kind of feel the setting in a very intimate way. It feels like you're there. Another thing is her tension. I think that can kind of go into vibes, but there's always this sense of unease or what's coming next, even if there is nothing next. But that also transcends into she does do plot twists. So I'm not going to say if all of them have plot twists, but there is generally something that happens that gives you this wow factor at some point in the book where things turn or something twists on its head, and then the plot continues moving forward, sometimes in a completely different direction. Another thing I think is the themes. So she focuses, a lot of the time there is queer love at the heart of these, but there's also, I think a lot of the time, a relationship between different classes of society, the dichotomy between those classes. And while I don't think it's heavy-handed thematic content, it's something that you feel that is very present in most of these books. There's, generally speaking, between the characters some sort of class lines that exist. Okay, I'm going to talk about the books one by one, and I'm going to talk about them in chronological order. So not publication order, but the chronology of the time eras that she's writing in. So the first one is Fingersmith, probably her most well-known. This was written, this takes place in the 1860s, and essentially a woman that is an orphan and is taken in by a family, and they're all swindlers, they're fingersmith, they take stuff, and she is, your protagonist is kind of granted this opportunity to go to a Gothic mansion or a mansion of some sort and attempt to swindle someone out of their inheritance, swindle a woman out of her inheritance. And things ensue from there. One thing I do think is important to note with Sarah Waters' books is that they are not plot-wise, theme-wise, tone-wise smooth. And what I mean by that is sometimes there are definitive parts in her books. This book has Fingersmith has two defined parts. And they feel very different from each other. So I think that what can happen with Sarah Waters' books is that you can feel very invested in the first part, and it can go on a trajectory that you're not a huge fan of. Or you might like the second part of a book or a third part of a book, but if they didn't capture you at the beginning, you might DNF it and not get there, or you might just not be invested enough. I, generally speaking, prefer her ones that are a little bit smoother in how they have less flips in what's going on. I kind of always like to describe it like some of her books kind of feel like you are driving in a car and then someone slams on the brakes to make a right turn, and that sensation can be a little jarring. For me, it's kind of harder to get out of that and drive into the, be comfortable with the new road we're driving on, I guess. It takes me a while to get used to it. But I don't think that's true for a lot of readers. Next on the list, we enter the 1870s, and you have Affinity. And Affinity is dual timeline, and the timelines aren't super far apart, 1872 and 1874. And you are following a woman who is in, I think, her late 20s, so a spinster. And she has depression. And she's from the upper crust and doesn't have to do anything with her days. And so starts going to a women's prison to help out and becomes fascinated with a specific prisoner. And their relationship develops, and the backflashes you get are the prisoner's backflashes to the events that kind of led up to why she's there. This one is one that, again, like in the first one, you have someone from like the lower crust, that's your protagonist, who is trying to swindle money out of a wealthy person. The Affinity is the opposite, where you're following someone from upper crust society and you're seeing her and her views of prisoners and her views and biases on them and what their lives would or would not be outside of the prison. Then we move up to the 1890s, and the next one is Tipping the Velvet. Tipping the Velvet is Sarah Waters' queer coming-of-age story. This takes place mainly in London, and you're following a girl becoming a woman, finding her sexual identity, and trying to make it in London. And for me, this one has very distinct differences in the plot, in the tone, and in the pace in those three parts of the narrative. And you're kind of seeing different parts of your protagonist's life as she starts to grow up. Okay, next we are now in the 1920s, and this is The Paying Guest. The Paying Guest is about a family post-World War I where the men have passed away, partially due to the events in the war, and they are now destitute, but they have a big mansion. So they can't afford the upkeep of this place. So they choose to take on paying guests, and it's a couple, and you're following a young adult who and her mother, and you start to watch this woman develop a relationship with these younger paying guests, the couple, and the dynamic between them from a class perspective, and the dynamic from a social perspective. And this one starts very slow, is very character and relationship focused, and has definitely different parts to the narrative. This one has 3 different parts with very different paces and tones. For me, I was able to follow along a little bit better than the shifts in the parts of Tipping the Velvet, because the plot didn't change as much as it did with, I don't even know how to describe that, because that's not necessarily true, but it wasn't as intense of a shift for me personally. And maybe that's because the actual setting didn't change as much each time. Okay, the next is The Night Watch. This takes place in the 1940s. So this one takes place after and during World War II. So this one is, from a structure perspective, told a lot differently than the other ones. This one has, I think 3 different parts, and they are going backwards in time. So you start in like the mid 40s, and then you end in 1941. This one has a larger cast of characters that you're actually following as protagonists. From that perspective, I do think it's a little bit more challenging to get into quickly, as is the case, I think, with any book that has a lot of different perspectives that you're following, because it takes a little bit longer to know them, to learn them, to understand their motivations, and then to sink into the narrative. And then you get pushed backwards in time, and you see them in the past, and you're more seeing the things that brought them to the position that they were in, and then you kind of do that a second time. That type of structure, I think, is a hard thing to achieve at and be successful at, and I do think that Sarah Waters was able to tell a really interesting story where she's not duplicating too much information, she's not leaving too much out, she's not putting too much in. Like, I think there's like a just right where you have enough questions about the past that you then get enough answers when you go back into the past. Okay, and the last one is in the late 40s. This one is the only one that is not overtly queer. And in it, you're following a man, which is different than all of the others. And you're following a single doctor who didn't grow up super well-to-do, but pushed and became a physician. And this is back in the time where physicians would maybe have a practice, but also take a lot of house calls. And he starts taking house calls to this mansion that is in a similar predicament to the paying guest, where they do not have the funds to sustain it. So it's this woman and her 2 children, and they are adult children, and they are attempting to make it work and do the labor of maintaining this house, while still having an air about them of thinking that they are in some ways better than other people because of their estate. This is like a creepy gothic mansion story that is focused more, I think, on tension and vibes than a lot of her other books. There's a lot of queasiness. Did that happen or did it not? The questioning of people's mental states, which, now that I'm thinking about that does appear in one of her books, but I think to a lesser degree than this one. All right, so I gave very vague overviews of all of the books. Now I'm going to go through them in publication order. So Tipping the Velvet was published in 1998, then Affinity in 1999, Fingersmith in 2002, The Night Watch in 2006, The Little Stranger in 2009, and The Paying Guest in 2014. So she has not published in about a decade at this point. So now I'm going to go through the Goodreads ranking, starting at the least popular and making it to the most popular. So in last place with a 3.45 star is The Paying Guest. In fifth place with 3.57 stars is The Little Stranger. In fourth place with 3.7 stars is The Night Watch. In third place with 3.75 stars is Affinity. In second place with 4.02 stars is Fingersmith, which I was actually surprised about. And in first place with 4.05, so not much higher, is Tipping the Velvet. So as a rundown, three separate parts, very character focused, and then becomes very plot focused, with class dynamics involved. Very tension focused, creepy, with class dynamics involved, the invasion of people's space, questioning of relationships and people and like their mental state, definitely. The Night Watch, kind of a coalition of a lot of people's lives, how people get to where they're at, very character focused, very relationship focused, focused on like how you're affected by the decisions you make, by the interactions you have, and how that kind of sets you up for the future. There are class differences at hand, but it's more focused on situational differences in people's lives. Affinity, very heavily relationship focused, very heavily focused on class dynamics and with a dual timeline. Fingersmith, focused again on class dynamics, lots of tension. You got like in a mansion, an isolated setting, and like the tensions that are brewing in the household for different reasons. And then Tipping the Velvet, coming of age, a little bit more raunchy, and then again, big tonal shifts to me. Now I'm going to give my reading order, and then I'll go into my favorites and like do an ordering of that. So I read Fingersmith first. I read this years ago. I honestly don't remember it super well at this point. Then I came to Affinity, then Tipping the Velvet, then The Paying Guest, then The Night Watch, and then The Little Stranger. Now, I'm going to go through my favorites from least to most favorite. What I will say about this list, because if you watch me at all, you know I don't like ranking stuff, but I'm pushing myself. I'm pushing myself out of my comfort zones, is that I have a very definitive number 1 and number 6, and my 2 through 5 is kind of loose. But the 1 and 6 are very definitive for me. Okay, so in 6th place, my least favorite, my definitive least favorite, is The Little Stranger. I did not like the protagonist. I did not think the execution of the spooky, eerie tension was well done, or my favorite interpretation or version of this. And I wasn't a huge fan of the romance plotline that develops in this. Overall, I actually did not like this book. And it's the only Sarah Waters book I could say that to. All the other ones I enjoyed, I would come back to again. This one, it's not happening. Okay, my number 5 is The Night Watch. So, like I said, 1 through 5, I like all of them. For me, I prefer when Sarah Waters does a deep focus on a few characters as opposed to having multiple characters interacting and seeing how all of them come together. I think it was really well executed, but I love Sarah Waters for the visceral, emotional response that I have to characters' emotions, to plots, twists, to the tension and the atmosphere, and this just gave me that a lot less than other ones. So in my number 4 position is Tipping the Velvet. I liked this book. I liked the coming of age story. I liked the setting. I liked the male impersonators and that whole vibe. And I liked that this one was more raunchy and that it had, it didn't shy away from the intense feelings of first love and kind of putting those things on the page. But for me, the 3 parts were very hard to get adjusted to. And it made the reading experience just feel very jarring for me. And they almost felt like 3 different books in tone and plot and pace. And it just wasn't, I loved a lot about it. The first part was by far my favorite part of it. But yeah, just didn't do it for me as much. Okay, number 3 is Fingersmith. This one, it could very well change if I did a reread, because this one is something that lives kind of far back in my brain because it's been so long since I read it. I remember my experience being that I enjoyed the plot twists as they came. I had an extremely visceral response to something that happens to the protagonist in the second part of the book that made me feel quite claustrophobic just reading what she was going through. But overall, for me, it was a little long for what it was accomplishing. And there were times where I felt that it kind of stalled out in pacing because of that. I think if you took off if you made this book a little shorter, it would have been higher up on my list. Okay, so my number 2 and my number 1 spots. So I'll go through both of them at the same time, and then I'll talk through my number 2 and my number 1. So my number 2 is The Paying Guest, which means my number 1 is Affinity. So The Paying Guest, I did this as a buddy read, which I think because of the reading experience and having a lot of fun reading it with someone, I read it with Gina at Gina Stainer Books. I think that in my mind's eye, in my recollection, makes me like this book even more. I loved watching the 3 kind of people coming together, the couple and the young woman who lives with her mother. I liked the first part for me really hooked me. I was really interested and motivated to read the character relationships, which I know is not why some people do not like this book as much. And then something happens and the plot just takes off. So you get really invested in the characters, and then something happens and the plot just goes soaring, and I'm just like, what is happening? And it was just super bingeable for me. I really enjoyed this one. There's some things that happen at the end that aren't super believable, but I was so invested it didn't matter. Okay, and then my number 1 is Affinity. I loved this one. This one is definitely her shortest one. I love the dual timeline. I really liked the eerie atmosphere. I love the thematic content of having these the dichotomy of classes. This rich woman going into this prison to act as a role model for people, and then her just intense fascination with this one prisoner and seeing that prisoner's background, and then the end hit me hard, and it's something where I audibly gasped and was like, is that really what just happened? And I just love a book like that. So yeah, this is definitely my number one. Okay, so these are the differences in what Goodreads and what the general public thinks is the best to the worst, and then mine. As you can see, they're quite different. So I think that I'm kind of my preferences when it comes to Sarah Water books are maybe in contrast to a lot of people. Now, another thing I want to talk about is it's only 6 books. So I see a lot of questions around of what should you read if you like Sarah Waters? And some of the internet answers Dickens. It's not gay though. I mean, I've never read Dickens, but it's not going to be gay. And so little less exciting for me personally. So I have 2 books that I think fill the same niche or parts of the same niche. One of them is recommendations that are modern that I think if you like Sarah Waters for certain capacities, you might like these books. So the first one is The Fair Fight by Anne. My mind's saying Bishop, it is absolutely not Bishop. Anna Freeman. This I read years and years ago and loved it. Okay, so this is a woman. You follow a woman. She's pretty young. She might be a teenager when it starts, or she might be a young adult. I don't quite remember. But she is born in a brothel, and she's living a hard life, and she meets this wealthy man, and he brings her into the world of underground boxing, and she becomes a fighter. And it's just kind of visceral and descriptive in the same way that a lot of Sarah Waters books are. It takes place, I believe, in London partially, and then other parts of the UK and Great Britain. I don't know the right thing to say. And then there is you follow that woman, you follow the wealthy guy that she meets, and then you follow the wealthy guy's wife, who is housebound for reasons. And you see each of their perspectives, and you see this wealthy woman that's kind of kept in a house and doesn't really interact or engage with a lot of people, and her experiences and her relationship with her brother. And then you see him or the husband and kind of what he does, and then you see this who I thought was the best protagonist, this kind of rough and tumbling, from the streets kind of gal, and just the interactions between them from a class perspective. So if you like that kind of part of, and then I don't remember when it takes place. Victorian? I think it takes place in the Victorian times. 18th century Bristol. So not London, Bristol. So yeah, if you're into those parts of Sarah Waters, this is a recommendation. A recommendation I have for the queer kind of coming of age that is not tipping the velvet at all, but has some of the same things, male impersonator, and is historic fiction, is Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Melinda Lowe. Now this, while tipping the velvet is a coming of age with the intended audience being adults, Last Night is a coming of age intended to be read by teenagers, so it's YA. I just read this recently and really loved it. So this takes place in 1950s San Francisco, specifically mainly in Chinatown. Your protagonist is a Chinese teenager who lives in Chinatown and goes to public school, where she develops a relationship with a classmate who is white. And they start going to what they kind of later realize, or your protagonist realizes, is a lesbian club. and it's where women do male impersonation. So some of the same elements of storytelling that Tipping the Velvet has, not as raunchy or as crass, but I personally really loved it. I'm biased. I grew up near San Francisco, so I like when things are set in the Bay Area, and then it has the historic elements as well, and like the tensions of first love and first affection, and being queer in a society that does not see that as an acceptable way to be. So yeah, those are 2 additional recommendations. I hope this video was helpful in any capacity. And if you have any recommendations of books that I should read because I liked these, please let me know. I am always down for a Sarah Waters, for the fans of Sarah Waters type rec. But that is all I got. So until next time, happy reading.